Langston Reed, a successful black CEO, returns to his small hometown with plans to revitalize the community through a major development project. Instead of support, he faces relentless harassment and systemic racism, including intimidation by a corrupt, racist police officer and a councilman. Intent on protecting his own interests, Langston becomes the target of false accusations, public smear campaigns, and abuse of power designed to tear him down. As tensions escalate, he is forced into a battle against a system built to silence him, exposing deep-rooted prejudice and corruption in a town unwilling to change. The sun had nearly disappeared behind the trees when Isaac Bennett pulled into the driveway of his childhood home. The old house stood against the twilight, its once vibrant blue paint now dulled and chipped, as though time itself had forgotten this place. For a moment, Isaac sat in his truck, his hands still gripping the steering wheel as he stared at the house. He hadn't been back in 10 years, not since his mother passed, not since his father shut the door behind him and never called him back. The text he'd received the night before echoed in his mind. "Your father's not well. You need to come home." Home. The word felt hollow now. He remembered the smell of fresh apple pie on the windowsill, the sound of his mother's laughter mixing with the creak of the porch swing. But those memories were fragile, ghosts that vanished when he blinked. With a sigh, Isaac grabbed his bag and stepped out of the truck. The gravel crunched under his boots as he made his way to the porch. The wooden steps groaned beneath his weight, as if protesting his return. He paused, staring at the front door, his heart pounding harder than it should have. He knocked twice. The silence stretched for so long that Isaac considered turning back to the truck. Then he heard it, the slow, shuffling footsteps on the other side of the door. When it creaked open, Isaac barely recognized the man standing there. His father, Charles Bennett, once a towering figure of strength and discipline, looked smaller now. His shoulders were hunched, his face gaunt and unshaven, his eyes dull and unfocused. "Dad," Isaac said, his voice low. Charles stared at him for a long moment, his lips parting as though to speak, but no words came. Then, without warning, he turned and walked back into the house, leaving the door ajar. Isaac hesitated, his hand tightening around the strap of his bag before he stepped inside. The air smelled stale, tinged with the faint bitterness of something burning. Shadows clung to the corners of the room, where the light from the flickering lamp couldn't reach. Isaac's gaze swept over the living room, the same plaid couch, the same bookshelf stuffed with his mother's old paperbacks, but everything was covered in a thin film of dust. "Dad, you okay?" he called out, his voice echoing faintly. From somewhere deeper in the house, Charles's voice floated back, hollow and distant. "Don't go in her room." Isaac froze. The hairs on the back of his neck stood on end. "Whose room?" he asked, though he already knew the answer. But the only response was the sound of a door clicking shut down the hall. Isaac's chest tightened as he dropped his bag onto the floor. His father had always been a man of few words, but this was something else. Something was wrong. Deeply wrong. And Isaac had a sinking feeling that whatever it was had been festering here for a long, long time. The morning light slanted through the tall, oak-framed windows of Langston Reed's study, bathing the room in gold. Outside, the rustling leaves and the distant hum of the city painted a picture of calm, but inside, Langston's world was anything but. The morning paper lay spread across his polished mahogany desk, the headline staring up at him like a challenge. "Reed Industries sparks local uproar with new development plan." Langston leaned back in his leather chair, letting his fingers drift over the edge of the paper. He'd grown used to seeing his name in print, praised one day, condemned the next. He'd learned long ago that success came with a spotlight, and the light didn't always warm. He was a black man at the head of a billion-dollar conglomerate, one of the most powerful voices in business, and no matter how quietly or humbly he carried himself, someone was always ready to remind him of the weight of his crown. His phone buzzed on the desk, cutting through his thoughts. Langston picked it up and answered, his voice deep but smooth. "Reed." "Langston, we need you here," said a familiar voice. It was Calvin Hughes, his head of PR, though this morning his voice sounded more frazzled than usual. "The Chamber of Commerce meeting starts at noon, and we've got protesters outside already. the media's circling like vultures. Langston sighed quietly. I'll be there in an hour, let them shout themselves hoarse for now. They're calling you a gentrifier, Langston, Calvin added, as though he hadn't heard him. The council's going to come down hard on this if we don't. I'll handle it, Calvin. Langston's tone was firm, but calm. The kind of calm that had built empires. He ended the call and set the phone down. He stood and walked to the window, gazing out over the city he had helped transform. A skyline of steel and glass rose in the distance, the fruits of his vision, his labor. But farther out, on the city's edges, were the neighborhoods where he'd grown up, streets that had taught him resilience, communities that had shaped his character. It was those same streets he fought for now, despite what the headline said. Daddy? The soft voice pulled him from his thoughts. He turned to see his daughter, Ava, standing in the doorway. At 7 years old, she had her mother's smile and his eyes. Sharp, observant, always seeing more than they should. She hugged a worn teddy bear to her chest, wearing a Navy school uniform that looked just a bit too neat, as though she were afraid of smudging it. Langston smiled and crouched slightly. You're up early, sweetheart. Mom said you have to go to a meeting, Ava said. Can you take me to school first? Langston's expression softened. Of course I can grab your shoes and backpack, and we'll head out in 10. She beamed, dashing off down the hallway. Langston grabbed his navy blazer off the back of his chair and shrugged it on, smoothing it over his crisp white shirt. Most men in his position would have paired it with designer cufflinks and a tailored vest, but Langston preferred simple, understated elegance. He didn't need his wealth to speak for him. His actions did that well enough. 15 minutes later, Langston pulled his black Range Rover into a small, familiar diner at the edge of downtown. Reggie's Grill had been a staple in this neighborhood for as long as Langston could remember. It was where he used to come after school with his father for burgers and root beer floats. Now, it was where he came when he needed a reminder of who he was and where he came from. Why are we stopping? Ava asked, peering curiously out the window. Because I need coffee, Langston said with a small grin, and Reggie makes the best. He stepped out of the SUV and rounded to help Ava out, her backpack bouncing as she skipped toward the door. Langston followed her, hands in his pockets, the sun glinting off his clean-shaven head. Despite his stature, over 6 feet tall and built like a man who hadn't skipped a day at the gym since college, there was an unassuming quality about him. Inside, the diner looked much the same as it had 30 years ago. Cracked vinyl booths, checkered floors, and the faint aroma of coffee, grease and pancakes. Reggie himself stood behind the counter, a wiry man with graying hair and an apron that had seen better days. Langston smiled warmly. Morning, Reggie. Reggie looked up and squinted for half a second before recognition dawned. Well, I'll be damned, Langston Reed, back in my little joint? Langston chuckled. I couldn't stay away. 1 coffee black and something sweet for this one. He rested a hand on Ava's shoulder. On the house, Reggie said, already pouring the coffee. You made it out of this neighborhood, Langston. You earned it. Langston's smile faltered ever so slightly at the comment, but he nodded his thanks. He took a seat at the corner booth, Ava sliding in across from him, her little legs swinging under the table. They hadn't been sitting long when the door chimed, and 3 men walked in. Langston glanced up instinctively. They were younger, mid-30s, wearing work jackets and jeans. One of them gave a glance in Langston's direction, his eyes lingering for a beat too long before he turned away. Don't worry about them, Reggie said quietly, as he set Langston's coffee down. They don't like seeing someone like you come back here. Langston arched a brow. Someone like me? Reggie sighed, leaning closer. A rich man. A black rich man. They think you've forgotten what it's like to be one of them. Langston leaned back in his seat, his gaze flicking toward the men again. They were talking loudly now, just loud enough to be overheard. The whole neighborhood's changing. They're knocking everything down and calling it progress. Bet he don't care. The words stung more than they should have. Langston took a sip of his coffee, his face unreadable. Daddy? Ava said softly, her brow furrowed. Are they mad at you? Langston's chest tightened. He reached across the table, covering her hand with his own. No, sweetheart, they're just upset about things changing. Why? Because change can be scary, Langston said gently. But sometimes it's the only way forward. The men laughed loudly from across the diner. Langston set his cup down carefully, his jaw clenching just slightly. He had learned long ago not to let words shake him, especially when they came from people who didn't understand the weight of leadership. But the tension was there now, crackling like static in the air. The diner that had felt so welcoming minutes ago now felt stifling, like everyone was watching, waiting. Langston finished his coffee and stood, helping Ava out of the booth. He caught Reggie's eye as he left a $20 bill on the table. "Keep the change," Langston said softly. Reggie gave him a small, understanding nod. As Langston stepped out into the morning sun, the weight of those unspoken accusations followed him. He knew this wouldn't be the last time his intentions were questioned, his presence unwelcome. Wealth, success, and power didn't shield him from the undercurrents of prejudice. They only made him more visible. Langston opened the car door for Ava and watched as she climbed in, her carefree innocence untouched by what had just passed. He shut the door and turned back toward the diner, his eyes narrowing slightly. Whatever was coming, whatever challenges lay ahead, Langston Reed wasn't a man who turned away. Not now. Not ever. Langston was halfway through buckling Ava into her car seat when the low rumble of an engine caught his attention. A police cruiser pulled into the diner's small parking lot, its tires grinding against gravel. Langston glanced up, instinctively straightening. Two officers climbed out, both white, both tall enough to carry their authority like a badge itself. Langston didn't think much of it at first. Small-town cops loved their coffee as much as anyone. But as he closed Ava's door and turned to get in the driver's seat, he noticed one of the officers watching him. Watching him. The older of the two, Officer Miller, Langston could just make out the name on his badge, tipped his chin toward Langston's car. "Morning," he called, voice curt, but polite. "Morning," Langston replied, his tone even. He opened his own door, but Miller's voice stopped him. "Sir, hold on a second." Langston turned slowly, already feeling Ava's eyes on him through the window. The other officer stood back, arms crossed over his chest, while Miller approached with casual authority, like a man walking up to a minor inconvenience. "You driving this car?" Miller asked. Langston's brows lifted slightly. "Yes, I am." The officer gestured to the Range Rover. "Nice ride, you got your license and registration on you?" Langston's jaw tightened, but his face remained calm. He reached into his jacket pocket slowly, retrieving his wallet. "Is there a problem?" "Just a routine check," Miller said, though his tone made it clear it was anything but routine. "We've had some reports of stolen vehicles in the area. Can't be too careful." Langston could feel his pulse begin to rise, a tight heat building in his chest, but he kept his voice measured. "This car isn't stolen, it's registered in my name. I'll be happy to show you my ID." He handed over his license, watching as Miller scrutinized it longer than necessary. "Langston Reed," Miller read aloud, his lips curling slightly around the name. "The Langston Reed big-shot businessman from the city?" Langston didn't react. "That's correct." Miller gave an exaggerated nod, handing the license back. "Never thought I'd see someone like you around here. Must be nice, riding around in a car like this." Langston ignored the implication, tucking his license neatly back into his wallet. "If that's all, officer, I'd like to get my daughter to school." Miller didn't move. Instead, he gestured vaguely to the back seat, where Ava was watching now with wide, worried eyes. "That's your daughter?" "Yes." "She yours?" Miller pressed. "Just asking because we've seen situations where kids aren't always with their—" Langston's calm cracked just slightly. "That's enough." His voice was low, controlled, but there was steel in it now. "You've seen my ID, and you've confirmed the car is mine. If there's nothing else, I'm leaving." For a long moment, Miller didn't reply. The two men stared at each other, one testing boundaries, the other refusing to budge. Finally, Miller took a small step back, though his smile never reached his eyes. "Drive safe, Mr. Reed." Langston said nothing. He climbed into the car, shutting the door with just a bit more force than necessary. As he started the engine and pulled away from the diner, he glanced in the rearview mirror. Miller was still watching, hands on his belt, his partner saying something that made him smirk. Langston's grip on the steering wheel tightened, the leather creaking beneath his fingers. Ava broke the silence first. "Why did he ask you all those questions, Daddy?" Langston inhaled slowly, choosing his words carefully. "Sometimes, people make assumptions about other people." "What kind of assumptions?" she asked. Langston hesitated, his eyes fixed on the road ahead. She was too young to carry the weight of answers she couldn't yet understand. "The kind that don't matter," he said finally. "All that matters is that you know who you are." Ava nodded, satisfied for now, but Langston's mind churned. "You know who you are." The word sounded hollow in his ears. He knew exactly who he was. A man who'd spent years proving himself over and over, in boardrooms, interviews, and public opinion. And yet, here he was, standing at the mercy of a cop who didn't care about his name, his power, or his character. No matter how much he achieved, to some people, all they'd ever see was the color of his skin. By the time Langston arrived at the Chamber of Commerce meeting downtown, he was back in control. The pristine building stood in stark contrast to the diner's worn charm: marble steps, shining glass doors, and polished brass fixtures that practically screamed old money. Langston adjusted his blazer as he walked through the entrance, offering a curt nod to the receptionist. "Mr. Reed, the council's waiting for you in room 4, she said, barely glancing up from her computer. He made his way down the corridor, his footsteps echoing in the quiet halls. Calvin was already waiting outside the meeting room, a tablet in hand, and worry etched into his face. "You're late," Calvin whispered sharply. "I had an unexpected stop," Langston replied, his voice clipped. Calvin's gaze searched his face, picking up on something unsaid. "Everything okay?" Langston didn't answer. Instead, he pushed open the heavy wooden door to the meeting room. Inside, a group of council members sat around a long conference table. 5 men and 2 women, all in varying shades of gray suits. Most of them looked up as Langston entered, though a few barely glanced away from their notes. At the far end of the table sat Councilman Walter Graves, a broad-shouldered man with slicked-back hair and a perpetual frown. "Mr. Reed," Graves said, his tone neutral but cold. "Nice of you to join us." Langston smiled faintly, walking toward the head of the table. "Thank you for having me, Councilman. I'm looking forward to addressing any concerns." "You'll have plenty to address," Graves shot back, tapping a folder on the table. "Let's begin." Langston took his seat, unbothered by the hostility in Graves's tone. He was used to it. He'd faced worse in boardrooms filled with sharks. Over the next hour, the council members grilled him relentlessly. The new development project Reed Industries had proposed, a mixed-use complex with affordable housing, retail spaces, and parks, was supposed to revitalize a struggling neighborhood. But Graves and his allies painted it as something sinister. "You call it progress," Graves said at one point, leaning forward. "But people are being pushed out of their homes, generations of families priced out. You're profiting off their suffering." Langston kept his expression calm. "That's not true, Councilman. We've offered relocation assistance and subsidized rent programs. Every decision has been made with the community in mind." Graves sneered. "Easy to say from your penthouse office." Langston ignored the jab. "This project will create jobs, modernize infrastructure, and provide opportunities the community hasn't seen in decades. If you'd look at the reports." "I've seen the reports," Graves interrupted. "What I haven't seen is you taking responsibility for the damage your so-called progress has caused." Langston's hands curled into fists beneath the table. For years, he'd poured his time, energy, and money into lifting communities that others had written off, and yet, men like Graves refused to see the truth. "Councilman," Langston said evenly, though his voice carried a sharp edge, "progress isn't comfortable. Change is hard for people who've been neglected for generations, but pretending we don't need it is far worse." A murmur ran through the room, and Graves's face darkened. "Spoken like a man who doesn't have to live with the consequences." Langston met his glare, unflinching. "You're wrong. I do live with them every day." The meeting ended shortly after, though the tension lingered like smoke in the air. Calvin walked beside Langston as they left the building, his tablet clutched tightly against his chest. "That was rough," Calvin muttered. "Graves is playing dirty." Langston exhaled slowly, the weight of the morning pressing down on him. He doesn't care about the truth, he cares about winning. So what now? Langston paused at the top of the steps, his gaze sweeping over the city sprawled before him. Now, he said quietly, we keep fighting. The truth always finds a way. But even as he said the words, Langston couldn't shake the nagging sense that the fight was just beginning. And it was going to get a lot worse before it got better. Langston's phone rang just as he stepped into his office later that afternoon. The skyline loomed outside the window, its glass towers shimmering in the sun, monuments to power, wealth, and progress. But Langston had no time to admire the view. The tension from the council meeting still gnawed at him, Graves's accusations echoing in his ears like a dull headache. He checked the caller ID, Mitchell Freeman. Langston picked up immediately. Mitchell! Langston, Mitchell said, his voice low and hesitant. You're not going to like this. Langston's stomach sank. Mitchell Freeman was a well-placed city official and one of the few people Langston trusted in this fight. If he was calling, it wasn't good. Talk to me, Langston said, his tone sharp. I've been hearing things, whispers mostly, but it's serious. Graves has friends in high places, and they're looking for ways to take you down, any way they can. This development plan has them rattled. You're making waves in places you don't want to. Langston frowned, his mind working quickly. What does that mean? Are they threatening to shut the project down? It's bigger than that, Mitchell replied. They're digging into you personally, your taxes, your businesses. Hell, I wouldn't be surprised if they're surveilling your family, Langston. They want to ruin you. Langston's grip on the phone tightened. Because I'm trying to improve the city? Because you're you, Mitchell said pointedly. They don't want someone like you having this much power. Langston leaned against the edge of his desk, his voice low and steady. Let them look, they won't find anything. Mitchell hesitated. I'm telling you this because I'm on your side, but I don't think they care about facts, Langston. They're going to create a scandal if they have to. Be careful, these people play dirty. The line went dead, leaving Langston staring at the phone in his hand, a cold anger simmering beneath his skin. He had faced opposition before, competitors, naysayers, politicians looking for a fight. But this felt different. It was personal. His thoughts were interrupted by Calvin bursting into the office, face pale and frantic. Langston, you need to see this. Calvin thrust his tablet forward. On the screen was a news headline, accompanied by a photo of Langston outside Reggie's diner, frozen mid-conversation with Officer Miller. CEO Langston Reed questioned by police in small-town incident. Langston's heart sank. The accompanying article was vague, heavy with insinuation, and completely devoid of context. Sources claim Reed was questioned about a suspicious vehicle. No charges were filed. It didn't matter that he'd done nothing wrong. The headline did its job, painting him as suspect, someone worth doubting. Calvin looked up at him, his voice barely above a whisper. This was no accident, Langston. Langston exhaled slowly, rage bubbling just beneath his calm exterior. No, it wasn't. By the time Langston arrived at Ava's school later that afternoon, the weight of the day pressed down on him like a boulder. He waited in the pickup line, the murmurs of other parents drifting through the cracked window. He didn't need to hear the words to know what they were saying. He could feel their stares like pinpricks on his skin. As Ava climbed into the back seat, he forced a smile. Hey, sweetheart. How was your day? Okay, she said softly, her usual cheer dampened. Some kids said they saw you on the news. They said you're in trouble. Langston's chest tightened, but his voice remained gentle. I'm not in trouble, Ava. Sometimes, people don't understand things and say things that aren't true. Why? He met her gaze in the rearview mirror. How could he explain something so ugly to someone so innocent? Because not everyone sees the world the way we do, but you don't worry about that, okay? I've got it handled. Ava nodded, but Langston could see the confusion and worry lingering in her eyes. It was just past 6 p.m. when Langston pulled into his driveway. He barely noticed the black sedan parked across the street until the door opened and two men stepped out. He froze, his hand still on the door handle as the first man approached. A man Langston instantly recognized, Officer Miller. Langston's face hardened, but he stepped out of the car slowly, keeping his movements calm and deliberate. Ava watched from the back seat, her little face pressed against the window. "Evening, Mr. Reed," Miller said, his voice dripping with mock politeness. "We got a call about suspicious activity around this address. Mind if we take a look?" Langston's jaw tightened, his tone clipped. "Suspicious activity? This is my house, officer. My family lives here." Miller shrugged. "Just following up on a report. You don't mind cooperating, do you?" Langston stepped forward, his towering frame forcing Miller to look up. "No, officer, I do mind. This is harassment, and we both know it." Miller's smile widened, but there was nothing kind about it. "Big words, Mr. Reed. You sure you don't want to just let us do our job?" Langston's voice dropped, low and dangerous. "If you have a warrant, officer, I suggest you show it. If not, this conversation is over." Miller's expression darkened, his smug facade slipping. He glanced back at the second officer, who lingered near the car, hands on his belt. Langston's pulse quickened. He could see how this was going to play out. Two men with badges, waiting for him to make the wrong move. "Daddy?" Ava's small voice broke through the tension. Langston turned slightly, keeping himself between her and the officers. "Stay in the car, sweetheart. It's okay." Miller took a small step forward, invading Langston's space. "You trying to start something, Reed?" Langston's body tensed, every fiber of him screaming to fight back, to shout, to make them see him. But he didn't. He wouldn't give them what they wanted. Instead, he held Miller's gaze, unblinking. "I want you off my property." Miller stared at him for a long moment, and for the first time, Langston saw it. Frustration. The officer hadn't gotten the reaction he wanted. Miller took a step back, sneering. "Have a nice night, Mr. Reed," he said finally, his voice heavy with disdain. Langston waited, unmoving, as Miller returned to the cruiser. The engine revved, and the car pulled away, leaving behind a silence so loud it rang in Langston's ears. He turned back to Ava, her eyes wide with fear. He opened the door, crouching to her level. "It's okay, baby. Everything's okay now." "Why were they so mean?" she whispered. Langston's throat tightened, but he managed a smile. "Sometimes people don't know how to be kind, but you don't have to worry about them, I promise." He lifted her out of the car, holding her close as he carried her inside. But even as the front door shut behind him, the tension remained. Thick, suffocating, like smoke from a fire he couldn't put out. That night, Langston sat in his study, the lights dimmed and a half-empty glass of whiskey at his elbow. The day replayed itself in his mind, every word, every stare, every accusation sharpening his anger, until it felt like a blade pressing against his skin. He thought of Miller's smug face, Graves' hostility, the headlines designed to smear his name. They weren't just coming after him, they were coming after everything he'd built. His reputation, his legacy, his family. And the worst part was, no matter how calm he stayed, how measured his words were, they saw what they wanted to see. Langston closed his eyes, exhaling slowly. They want a fight? Fine. He would give them one. Not on their terms, but on his own. Langston Reed stood at the head of the long, polished conference table, his jaw set, his patience thin. Around him, the board members of Reed Industries sat stiffly in their seats, exchanging glances that hovered between unease and skepticism. The meeting room, usually a space of calm negotiations and decisive leadership, was charged with an energy that felt combustible. "I'll say it plainly," Langston said, his voice sharp, cutting through the tension. "This smear campaign isn't about the development project, it's about me, about us." He paused, letting his words settle. "We've made too much progress, we've built something undeniable, and now there are people who can't stand to see it succeed. Because of where I come from, because of who I am." Around the table, some heads nodded, while others looked down at their notes, unwilling to meet his gaze. Calvin, seated near the far end, interjected, his voice urgent but controlled. "They're calling for investigations into our financials," Calvin said. "The council is stoking the fire, claiming irregularities in the acquisition of the land. Graves is already spreading the word to the press. This is getting out of hand." Langston turned his head slowly. "We have nothing to hide." "It doesn't matter," Calvin said, his tone exasperated. You know how this works. Perception is everything, and they're winning the perception battle. The news, social media, it's everywhere. Langston took a deep breath, his fists tightening at his sides. We'll face it, head on. Release the reports. Every document, every contract, transparency is our strongest weapon. One of the board members, a thin man in a gray suit named Patterson, cleared his throat. With all due respect, Mr. Reed, maybe you should consider stepping back for a while. This attention, it's not good for the company, for any of us. Langston's head snapped toward him, his eyes darkening. Step back? I'm just saying, Patterson continued, adjusting his tie. Perhaps a temporary leave of absence would ease some of the tension. Langston stared at him for a long, cold moment, his voice quiet but dangerous. You think me stepping back is going to stop this? You think these people care about the truth? He leaned forward slightly, his presence filling the room. They're not coming for the company. They're coming for me, and if I step back now, they win. They learn they can push us down, and we'll let them. No one said a word. The room was silent except for the faint hum of the air conditioning. Langston straightened, his gaze sweeping across the table. I will not step back, he said firmly, and I won't let any of you forget why we're here. We didn't build this company by backing down, and I'll be damned if I start now. That night, Langston returned home to find his driveway empty and his house darker than usual. His wife, Janelle, had taken Ava to visit her parents for the weekend, a decision made earlier that morning, after he'd quietly suggested they get some space away from the growing chaos. As Langston unlocked the front door and stepped inside, the stillness of the house wrapped around him like a heavy cloak. It was too quiet. He moved through the dimly lit rooms, his mind still churning with thoughts of the day's meeting, of Patterson's spineless suggestion, of Graves's grinning malice. He poured himself a drink and sank onto the couch. The whiskey burned, but it did little to quiet the storm inside him. He turned on the television, flipping absently through channels until the screen froze on the local news. His chest tightened. New developments in the Reed Industries controversy. The anchor's voice carried a polished neutrality, but the headline at the bottom of the screen was anything but neutral. Langston Reed under scrutiny for alleged land deal fraud. The report was slick, a careful arrangement of vague accusations and unnamed sources. The footage cut to a press conference where Councilman Graves stood in front of reporters, his face a mask of feigned concern. This is about accountability, Graves said smoothly. No one, no matter how powerful or wealthy, is above the law. Langston's blood ran cold as the screen flickered to an aerial shot of the development site, where protesters had gathered with signs that read, "Stop the greed and protect our homes." He set the glass down hard, the sound sharp against the silence. They're building the narrative, he thought. They weren't interested in facts, they were turning him into the villain. Before he could process it further, his phone buzzed. It was Calvin. "Langston," Calvin said, breathless. "It's Graves. He's filing a formal complaint with the city attorney. They're going to move for an injunction to freeze the development." Langston pinched the bridge of his nose. "On what grounds?" "Bogus ones," Calvin replied. "They're claiming corruption and improper acquisitions. Langston, listen, this isn't just political anymore. They're dragging your name through the dirt, and now they've got the legal system on their side." Langston's grip on the phone tightened. "Let them come. We'll fight this in court." Calvin hesitated. "You might not get that chance. Graves is going to push for a formal investigation, and you know how the optics look right now." Langston was silent for a beat, his pulse thudding in his ears. "Langston?" Calvin pressed. "I hear you," Langston said finally, his voice low. "Where's Graves now?" Calvin sounded startled. "What, I don't know. Probably still at City Hall." "Good." Langston stood, his resolve hardening. "I'm done playing defense." The halls of City Hall were empty by the time Langston arrived. The grand marble floors echoed with his footsteps as he strode toward Graves's office. Calvin had called twice on the drive over, but Langston ignored him. He wasn't here to argue. He wasn't here to beg. Graves's door was partially open, light spilling out into the hallway. Langston didn't bother knocking. He pushed the door open and stepped inside. Graves looked up from his desk, startled. but his expression quickly shifted into one of smug satisfaction. Well, well, Mr. Reed. To what do I owe this honor? Langston closed the door behind him, his movements slow and deliberate. Cut the act, Graves. I know what you're doing. Graves leaned back in his chair, folding his hands across his chest. I have no idea what you're talking about. You're manufacturing lies, Langston said, his voice steady but sharp. Dragging my name through the mud, for what? To keep me from improving this city. Graves's smile didn't falter. I'm just holding you accountable, Mr. Reed. It's what the people deserve. The people? Langston laughed bitterly. You don't care about the people, you care about power. You're threatened by me because I don't play by your rules. I don't owe you or your friends anything. Graves's face darkened slightly, his mask slipping. You think you're untouchable, he said, his voice a low growl. But you're not. I can bury you, Reed. I can make sure you lose everything you've built. Langston took a step closer, his presence towering over Graves. You're not going to bury me, Graves, because the truth has a way of coming out, and when it does, you're the one who's going to fall. Graves didn't respond. The silence stretched, charged and brittle. Langston held his gaze a moment longer, then turned and walked to the door. You don't know when to quit, Graves called after him, his voice mocking. Keep pushing, and you'll regret it. Langston paused at the threshold, turning just enough to look back. I don't quit, he said quietly. And I don't regret standing up for what's right. He stepped out into the hallway, the door closing behind him with a final thud. The tension in his chest felt like a coiled spring, ready to snap. They wanted him to back down. They wanted him afraid, cornered, defeated. But they didn't know Langston Reed. And this fight was far from over. Langston Reed stood outside City Hall, his broad shoulders squared, his jaw tight, and his eyes fixed on the crowd forming near the steps. Reporters and protesters gathered like a storm cloud, shouting questions, holding signs that read, "Stop the greed," and "Justice for our communities." At the center of it all stood Councilman Walter Graves, flanked by two uniformed police officers, their presence carefully choreographed for the cameras. Graves' smirk was barely concealed as he shook hands with community leaders, weaving through the crowd like a snake in tailored wool. Langston's fists tightened at his sides, but his expression remained composed. Calvin stood beside him, his face pale and drawn. This is a setup, Langston, Calvin said under his breath. Graves knows you're coming. He's going to try to make you look like the aggressor. Langston's voice was low but firm. Let him try. Calvin grabbed his arm. Listen to me, this is dangerous. They'll do anything to provoke you. If you lose your temper, they win. Don't play into it. Langston turned slightly, locking eyes with his friend. I've been calm my entire life, Calvin. I've been calm while they underestimated me, while they disrespected me, while they pushed me into corners. He looked back toward Graves. But calm doesn't mean quiet. Not today. Calvin exhaled, stepping back as Langston moved through the crowd, each step deliberate and unflinching. Voices swirled around him like white noise, but he tuned it all out, his focus on one man. Langston Reed! Graves' voice boomed from the steps, theatrical as ever. He lifted his hands as though addressing a congregation. Here to join the conversation, are you, or are you here to defend your questionable dealings in our community? A murmur rippled through the crowd. Cameras turned, lenses snapping into focus. Langston climbed the steps slowly, meeting Graves's smug gaze with a cool, unwavering stare. This isn't a conversation, Graves, Langston said, his voice carrying over the noise, deep and steady. It's a spectacle. You're not here for the community. You're here for power. Graves's smile faltered, just slightly. I'm here to hold people accountable, Mr. Reed. You've taken advantage of hard-working families, pushing them out of their homes so you can line your pockets. That's what this is about. Langston stopped a few steps below him, his voice cutting like glass. You don't get to talk to me about hard work, Graves. You've spent your career climbing on the backs of people who trusted you. People you promised to help while you pocketed bribes and handed out favors to your friends. Where was your accountability then? A shocked murmur rolled through the crowd, reporters snapping up Langston's words. Graves' face flushed red, but he quickly recovered, his voice rising with practiced indignation. Empty accusations, Graves barked. Typical deflection from a man who's been caught exploiting his own people. Langston took another step forward, now face to face with the councilman. His voice dropped, lethal in its calmness. You want to talk about exploitation? Tell them about the shell companies you used to buy land at half its value. Tell them about the deals you've cut behind closed doors, promising contracts to your cronies while pretending to care about this city. Graves's eyes widened, just for a split second, before narrowing. You can't prove that. Langston held his gaze, unblinking. Can I? He reached into his blazer pocket and pulled out a stack of documents, bound tightly with a clip. He lifted them for the crowd and cameras to see. This, Langston said, turning to face the crowd, is proof bank transfers, property records, names, dates. Every dirty deal that Graves has tried to hide under the table. I've spent weeks gathering this, and now the truth is going public. Graves's face turned ashen, his bluster deflating like a punctured balloon. That's fabricated, he stammered, pointing a shaking finger. This is slander, a desperate attempt to distract from your own crimes. Langston ignored him, stepping past the councilman to address the crowd. You're being lied to, he said, his voice ringing with authority. This development project was meant to uplift this community, to bring jobs, housing, and opportunity. I didn't come here to take from you. I came here because I believe in what this city can become. The crowd had quieted now, listening, unsure whether to cheer or remain skeptical. Langston looked out at their faces filled with frustration, fear, and hope. But Graves doesn't want you to see that, Langston continued, because the moment we succeed, his lies lose their power. The moment we come together, we become unstoppable. The silence hung heavy, charged with possibility. Then, Graves shoved past the officers, his voice cracking with rage. You don't belong here, Reed, he shouted, his composure gone. You think you can walk in here with your money and your promises, but you're just another outsider trying to take what isn't yours. Langston turned slowly, locking eyes with Graves. The crowd gasped, as though Graves had said something he couldn't take back. Langston's voice was steady and clear. I'm not an outsider. I was born here, I grew up here, and I'm not leaving. Graves' face twisted with anger, but before he could speak, another voice cut through the tension. That true, councilman? The crowd shifted, and Langston turned to see Mitchell Freeman standing near the edge of the steps. He held his phone in the air, the screen glowing. Because I just forwarded those documents to every news outlet in the city. Graves turned pale, his mouth opening and closing as though searching for words. Mitchell stepped forward, his voice calm but firm. It's over. Graves' people are going to see what you've been doing. The truth is out. The crowd erupted then, some shouting questions, others cheering. Graves stumbled back, his face a mixture of disbelief and panic. The police officers who had flanked him exchanged uncertain glances, clearly unsure where their loyalties now lay. Langston stood still, the weight of the moment settling over him. He had done it. He had exposed Graves for what he was. But the fight wasn't over yet. A reporter pushed through the crowd, microphone in hand. Mr. Reed, what's your next move? Do you plan to press charges against Councilman Graves? Langston turned toward the cameras, his expression resolute. My next move is what it's always been, fighting for this city and its people. Graves tried to tear us apart, but now, we build something stronger. More questions followed, but Langston didn't linger. He descended the steps, his heart still pounding, his thoughts racing. Mitchell fell into step beside him. Hell of a move, Langston, Mitchell said with a wry smile. Graves won't recover from this. Langston nodded, his gaze fixed ahead. Maybe not. But people like him don't go down quietly. We're not done yet. As they reached the street, Calvin appeared, his face flushed with excitement. You did it, Langston. Did you see the way Graves crumbled? It's all over the news already. Langston shook his head slightly. It's not over, Calvin. Not until the work is done. He looked back at City Hall, the crowd still buzzing with energy and questions. The fight had cost him time, energy, and peace. But he wasn't broken. He was still standing, and he was just getting started. Langston Reed's footsteps echoed sharply in the cavernous lobby of Millbrook's police station. The building, a hulking remnant of 1950s architecture, was all cold marble and outdated decor, its institutional sterility somehow matching the rot that lived beneath its surface. Langston had never been here before, but he knew enough to see what it represented: power wielded without accountability. Calvin trailed just behind him, whispering anxiously, "Langston, think this through. Walking in here. This is dangerous. Graves has friends on the inside. Daniels is one of them." Langston didn't look back. His face was set like stone, his voice measured. "Let them come, Calvin. It's time I stop running from their game and flip the board." He pushed through the double doors leading to the main office area. Rows of desks filled the room, manned by uniformed officers who glanced up, startled, as the two men entered. Langston's presence in this space was enough to silence conversations, their murmurs dying under the weight of his unflinching glare. Sitting at the far end of the room, sprawled back in a chair with his boots propped on his desk, was Officer Daniels. Langston's pulse quickened, but he didn't slow his pace. Daniels looked up, his lazy smirk widening into a grin as he took in the sight of Langston Reed walking toward him. "Well, look who decided to pay us a visit," Daniels drawled, dropping his boots to the ground with a heavy thud. He stood, towering but slouched, his hand resting casually on his belt near his holster. "Mr. Reed thought you preferred the fancy boardrooms and cocktail lounges." Langston stopped just feet away, his eyes locked on Daniels. "We need to talk." Daniels' grin widened as he glanced around the room. "Hear that, boys? The big man wants to have a word." A low ripple of laughter spread among the other officers, forced, but dangerous. Langston didn't flinch. "Outside now." Daniels raised his brows, clearly surprised. He straightened, squaring his shoulders, and for the first time, Langston saw the man's facade falter. Daniels was a bully, but bullies always crumbled when someone didn't blink first. "Sure thing, Mr. Reed," Daniels said, his voice dripping with mock courtesy. "Let's step outside." The air was heavy and humid as Langston followed Daniels into the narrow alley behind the station. The only light came from a flickering lamp above the back door. Calvin stopped just at the edge, hanging back as Langston stepped forward. Daniels turned to face him, his expression a mixture of arrogance and disdain. He stood with his arms crossed, his weight shifting slightly, a man too used to being untouchable. "So, what's this about, Reed?" Daniels sneered. "You here to file a complaint cry to someone about how mean I was to you the other day?" Langston's eyes narrowed, his voice low and steady. "No, I'm here to tell you it stops now. The harassment, the false reports, the threats. It ends here, Daniels." Daniels laughed, a short, ugly sound that echoed off the brick walls. "Ends you don't get to decide that you think because you've got money and a big name. You're untouchable. You're not. I know men like you." Langston stepped closer, his presence towering. "No. You think you know men like me. That's your problem. You see my skin, and you assume I don't belong where I am. You assume power is something I took, not something I earned. But I'm not afraid of you. Not you, and not the system you hide behind." Daniel's face twitched, his composure cracking. "Watch yourself, Reed. You don't know who you're messing with." "I know exactly who I'm dealing with," Langston shot back. "A man who uses his badge to intimidate, to protect his own interests, and to tear down anyone who doesn't fit into his small-minded view of the world." He paused, letting the words hang like a challenge. "And I know what you did." Daniels blinked, his sneer faltering. "What the hell are you talking about?" Langston reached into his pocket and pulled out a thin, neatly bound folder. "Property records, police reports, financial statements. You've been feeding Graves information about my development plan in exchange for land contracts on the outskirts of town." He flipped the folder open, holding up a photograph. "That's you, Daniels, signing off on a fraudulent sale last month. The land was purchased under a fake LLC, one Graves uses to funnel money back to his allies. You've been his muscle, helping him intimidate homeowners and falsify complaints to stop me from moving forward." Daniels's face went pale, the smirk vanishing. He tried to step closer, but Langston didn't budge. "You're bluffing," Daniels said, though his voice lacked conviction. Langston's voice dropped, sharp as steel. "I don't bluff. This is going to the state attorney, to the press, to everyone you've managed to fool until now. You can't bury this, Daniels. The whole town's going to know what you are." Daniels lunged, grabbing the front of Langston's blazer. "You son of a—" Before Daniels could finish, Langston seized his wrist with surprising speed, his voice deadly calm. "You don't scare me, Daniels, and you don't get to put your hands on me again." Daniels froze, his breath coming fast. Langston released his grip, letting Daniels stumble back a step. "You think you're going to come out of this on top?" Daniels barked, though there was desperation in his voice now. "You don't get it, guys like me. We are the system, Graves. Me, half the town council. We've been doing this for years. What makes you think you're going to change any of it?" Langston took a step forward, his voice ringing with quiet authority. "Because the truth doesn't stay buried forever. You can fight it, you can deny it, but sooner or later it comes out, and when it does, you'll fall, all of you." Daniel stared at him, his chest heaving, his hands clenching into fists. For a moment, Langston thought the man might swing, but then the door behind them creaked open. Mitchell stepped out, holding his phone up like a trophy. "Got all that, Officer Daniels?" Daniels whirled around, his face contorting in rage. "You son of—" "Careful now," Mitchell said smoothly, tucking the phone into his pocket. "You wouldn't want to make things worse for yourself." Langston turned to leave, pausing just at the door. He looked back over his shoulder, his expression calm, his voice steady. "It's over, Daniels. I'll see you in court." Daniels didn't reply. He just stood there, frozen in the alley as Langston walked away. Back inside, Langston leaned against the wall, his breath finally slowing as Calvin and Mitchell caught up to him. "You think it's enough?" Calvin asked, his voice low. Langston nodded, though the weight in his chest remained. "It's enough to start." Mitchell clapped him on the shoulder. "Graves and Daniels won't go quietly, but you hit them where it hurts. Now it's their move." Langston straightened, his eyes hardening with resolve. "Let them make their move. I'm ready." The door to the alley swung shut behind them, leaving Daniels alone in the dark. 3 days later, Millbrook was buzzing. The events of the showdown outside the police station had spread like wildfire. Media trucks clogged the streets, reporters huddled outside City Hall, and headlines painted a clear picture of the scandal unraveling at the highest levels. Corruption in Millbrook. Councilman Graves under investigation. Officer Daniels accused of abuse of power and fraudulent dealings. Langston Reed exposes systemic rot in local government. Langston Reed's name was everywhere, but for the first time, it wasn't accompanied by skepticism or suspicion. It was synonymous with something else: truth, justice, and courage. Langston stood at the window of his office, gazing at the skyline. The city felt different now, though nothing had physically changed. The streets, the buildings, the constant hum of life. It was all the same, but the people were watching now, their eyes open in a way they hadn't been before. "Langston," Calvin said, stepping into the room. He held a newspaper in one hand, the bold headline visible even from a distance. "Councilman Graves resigns amid mounting evidence of corruption." Langston turned slowly, the weight on his shoulders finally beginning to ease. "I saw it." Calvin grinned, shaking his head. "We did it. Daniels is suspended pending a full investigation, Graves is out, and the development project is back on track. The state attorney's office is already involved. This is bigger than any of us thought." Langston didn't smile, though the corner of his mouth twitched. "It's not just about them. Calvin Graves and Daniels were the face of it, but they weren't acting alone. There's more rot underneath, and it'll take time to clean it up." Calvin's grin softened. "You've started something, Langston. Something real. You should be proud of that." Langston nodded, though his gaze drifted back out the window. "Pride comes later. Right now, we get back to work." The courthouse was packed that afternoon, as Graves made his first public appearance since the scandal broke. The disgraced councilman walked through the doors, flanked by lawyers and avoiding eye contact with anyone. Gone was the smug confidence, replaced by a man who knew his power was crumbling around him. Langston was there, sitting quietly in the back of the room, his presence an undeniable symbol of victory. As Graves stood before the judge, the charges were read: conspiracy, fraudulent dealings, abuse of office. The words echoed through the room like a final nail in a coffin. Langston watched as Graves's shoulders sagged slightly, the weight of his actions finally settling over him. Calvin leaned over and whispered, "This feels good, doesn't it?" Langston didn't answer right away. He watched Graves, who had spent so long treating people like pawns, now stripped of his position, his power, and his allies. It wasn't triumph that Langston felt, but something deeper, a quiet, sobering sense of justice. "It feels right," Langston said finally. Outside the courthouse, reporters crowded the steps, their cameras trained on Langston as he emerged. The air was alive with questions, but he lifted a hand, silencing them. "I didn't come here to celebrate today," he said, his voice calm but firm. "What's happening in Millbrook is bigger than me, bigger than any one person. This isn't just about exposing corruption, it's about rebuilding trust. For too long, this city has been held back by fear, greed, and a system that serves itself instead of the people that ends now." The crowd quieted, the weight of his words sinking in. "This fight isn't over," Langston continued, his gaze steady. "But we've taken the first step, and I promise you, I'm not done fighting for this city, for its future for all of us." The reporters shouted more questions, but Langston turned and walked away, his heart lighter than it had been in weeks. That evening, Langston pulled his SUV into his driveway and sat for a moment, taking in the sight of his home. The porch light glowed warmly against the twilight, and inside, he could see Ava's small silhouette darting through the living room, laughter spilling from the open window. Janelle was standing on the porch when he stepped out of the car, her arms folded, but her face soft with understanding. "You've been running yourself ragged," she said as he climbed the steps. Langston smiled faintly. "It's done now. Graves resigned, Daniels is facing charges, the project's back on track." Janelle tilted her head, studying him carefully. "And you? How are you?" Langston sighed, the tension slowly draining from his shoulders. "Tired," he admitted. "But we did what we set out to do." She stepped closer, wrapping her arms around him. For a long moment, they stood in the quiet, the chaos of the last few weeks finally giving way to stillness. "Daddy!" Ava's voice rang out as she burst through the front door, barreling into his legs. Langston crouched, scooping her up into a hug. "You're home!" she exclaimed, her face beaming. "I'm home," Langston said softly, holding her close. "For good." A week later, Langston stood at the edge of the development site, the afternoon sun warm against his face. The ground had been cleared, construction equipment humming as workers prepared the foundation. It was just dirt and machinery now, but Langston could already see the future, the families who would live here, the businesses that would thrive, the children who would play in the park he'd promised to build. Mitchell joined him, holding a clipboard, but taking a moment to pause. "Looks like it's really happening," he said, smiling. Langston nodded. "It is." "You've got people talking, you know," Mitchell added, his tone turning serious. "What you did, standing up to Graves, taking on Daniels, it's given folks hope the city's waking up." Langston glanced at him, a small smile tugging at his lips. "Hope's a powerful thing." Mitchell nodded, looking back at the site. "So what's next? You going to run for mayor or something?" Langston chuckled. "One fight at a time, Mitchell. Right now, we make sure this gets built. After that, we'll see." Mitchell grinned. "Well, whatever you decide, you've got a lot of people behind you now." Langston looked out over the site again, his smile fading into quiet determination. "Good. Because we've got a long way to go." That evening, Langston sat on his back porch. Ava curled up beside him as they watched the sky darken. The stars blinked into view, soft and distant, and the air carried the faint scent of jasmine from Janelle's garden. "Daddy?" Ava asked, her voice sleepy. Are the bad people gone now?" Langston's chest tightened, but he stroked her hair gently. "Some of them are, but there's always more work to do." "Are you going to fix it?" He smiled, pressing a kiss to the top of her head. "I'm going to try, sweetheart, every day." She nodded, satisfied, and nestled closer. Langston stared up at the stars, his heart full of quiet resolve. He knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy, the fight against injustice was never truly over. But he had faced the worst they could throw at him, and he was still here, stronger, steadier, and unafraid. And tomorrow, he would fight again. For his family, for his community, for a better world. Millbrook was changing slowly, but undeniably. The headlines had shifted. Instead of whispers about scandal and controversy, the city was now buzzing with words like reform and accountability. Councilman Graves had resigned, his empire of corruption collapsing under the weight of evidence Langston had unearthed. Officer Daniels had been removed from the force, pending formal charges. The community that Graves and his allies had preyed upon, ignored for years, was beginning to find its voice, and at the center of it all stood Langston Reed. Langston sat alone in his office late one evening, the city sprawled out before him through the floor-to-ceiling window. The hum of construction at the development site could still be faintly heard, a reminder of what he had fought for. It was a sound that used to keep him up at night, a sound that now brought him peace. He leaned back in his chair, the weight of the past weeks settling over him like a memory, heavy, but no longer suffocating. So much had changed, and yet, so much remained the same. The next morning, Langston found himself back at Reggie's diner, this time alone. He took his usual spot at the corner booth, the one where he could see the entire room. A few heads turned when he entered, but this time there were no stares of suspicion, only quiet nods of acknowledgement. Respect. Reggie appeared a moment later, setting down a steaming mug of coffee. "You're becoming a regular again, Langston." Langston smiled faintly, wrapping his hands around the mug. "Guess I like the company." Reggie slid into the seat across from him, his gruff demeanor softened by the hint of a smile. "Been hearing folks talk about you, about what you did." Langston arched a brow. "Good things, I hope." Reggie shrugged. "Good? Bad? Everything in between. People are still figuring out what to make of all this. But one thing's clear. You shook things up, Langston. And maybe that's what this town needed." Langston nodded slowly, staring into the dark swirl of his coffee. "Change isn't easy, Reggie, but we can't keep pretending things are fine just because it's comfortable." Reggie's expression turned thoughtful. "People like Graves and Daniels, they've been here a long time. Men like that don't get power overnight, and they don't lose it without a fight. You showed people that fight can be won. That's something." Langston met his gaze, a quiet resolve in his eyes. "It's a start. But it's not enough. Not yet." Reggie studied him for a moment, then nodded. "You're not done, are you?" Langston exhaled, his lips curling into the faintest smile. "No, I'm not." Later that afternoon, Langston stood at the edge of the development site, watching the workers lay the first bricks of what would soon be affordable housing units. He could hear laughter in the distance, children playing at the edge of the lot, families walking by to see what was happening. It was a small thing, but it was hope made tangible. Janelle joined him, her hand slipping into his as they stood together in the sun. "You should be proud," she said softly. Langston nodded, his gaze never leaving the construction. "I am. But there's more to do. This isn't just about a development site. It's about the people Graves and Daniels tried to silence. They've been ignored for too long." Janelle squeezed his hand gently. "And you're giving them a voice." Langston's chest tightened, emotion threatening to break through the surface. "It shouldn't have to be this hard, Janelle, just to do the right thing." "I know," she whispered. "But you're showing them it's worth it." Langston turned to look at her, her face bathed in sunlight, a quiet strength in her eyes. "For Ava," he said softly. "For her generation, I want her to grow up knowing that change is possible, that the world can be better than this." "And it will be," Janelle said firmly. "Because of people like you." Langston nodded slowly, letting her words settle over him. 2 weeks later, Langston stood at a community forum held in the heart of Millbrook, a space that had once been forgotten, now packed to the walls with people eager to listen, to speak, to be seen. The air buzzed with a sense of unity and purpose Langston had rarely seen in this town. He stood at the front of the room, no podium, no barriers. Just him and the people. "I want to thank you all for being here today," he began, his voice strong and steady. "For too long, this city has been divided by lies, by greed, by fear. People like Graves and Daniels counted on that division. They counted on us staying quiet, on us turning against each other, instead of standing together." The crowd was silent now, every face turned toward him, listening. "But what they didn't count on," Langston continued, his gaze sweeping the room, "is the power we have when we come together. The truth came out because we fought for it, and the truth is, this city doesn't belong to men like Graves, it belongs to all of us, to the workers, the families, the children who deserve a future better than the one we were given. A murmur of agreement rippled through the crowd, growing louder. This fight isn't over, Langston said, his voice rising. But now we know how to win it. By showing up, by speaking out, by demanding better from the people who represent us, and by refusing to back down. A cheer erupted from the room, swelling like a wave. Langston looked out at the crowd, young, old, black, white, standing together, united for the first time in a long time. He saw hope in their eyes. As the applause faded, Langston stepped down and shook hands with the people who approached him. Neighbors, small business owners, community leaders, each one thanking him, encouraging him, telling him they were ready to fight for something better. And for the first time, Langston believed it. That night, Langston stood on his back porch, the stars spread out like a blanket above him. Ava sat beside him, her small hand wrapped around his thumb as she stared up at the sky. "Daddy?" she asked softly. Did you fix it yet?" Langston smiled faintly, the question so simple, yet so heavy. "Not yet, sweetheart, but we're getting closer." "Will it be better tomorrow?" Langston looked down at her, his heart full. "It'll be better because we'll keep trying. That's what matters. We don't stop." Ava smiled sleepily, resting her head against his arm. Langston gazed up at the stars, the quiet hum of the world surrounding him. The fight wasn't over. It never truly would be, but as long as he was standing, as long as he had a voice, he would keep fighting. For his family, for his community, for a future that was brighter, fairer, and full of hope. Because progress wasn't a finish line. It was a promise, one he intended to keep. And tomorrow, he would rise again.